Dear viewer, shut up. I want to talk to you about Bridgerton. So, season 3 of Bridgerton is finally coming out, and whenever my roommate Brett and I watch any film or TV that's set in the Regency or an adjacent period, we always end up hypothesizing about how we would do within this society, what would be our plan to be successful and popular. Usually it's just marry each other and have respective affairs with the gardener. Anyway, it occurred to me recently, why would I spend time fantasizing about my hypothetical place in this world? A world that is notoriously cruel to outsiders, where one wrong move could be the end of your place in polite society, where the only way women could assure their survival was to impress and attach themselves to a man of sufficient funds and reputation. That's kind of the antithesis of how I live my own life. One day I was browsing through Prime, I think, just looking for something to watch, and I was reminded of the existence of the film Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And it hit me, Regency romance is survivalist horror for those of us with soft skills. Wants to be in a zombie outbreak or a televised death match or any kind of post-apocalyptic dystopia, but there are people who watch media on these subjects, at least in part because they like to think about how they would hold up, the best strategies to use, if they'd last longer than their friends, what real-life skills do they currently possess that would serve them well in these disasters. I'm not one of these people. I know I wouldn't survive a televised death match. I have reason to believe I wouldn't survive a normal reality TV show, but that's a story for when my NDA expires. I am not athletic. I am not outdoorsy. I am friends with an internationally high-ranking axe thrower, but he once shoved me in front of him at a haunted house, so even that connection would not serve me well. However, I do possess above-average knowledge and skill in the subjects of music, literature, and languages. I am generally quick-witted and agreeable, and a theater reviewer once referred to me as swivel-hipped, which I feel would translate well to my perceived childbearing abilities. I am what the people of the Ton might refer to as accomplished, even though I have never made a shelter or killed anything bigger than a spider, and am apparently a pretty good distraction for monsters. So I, and I would guess many others, get the same kind of catharsis from watching period dramas as others do from survivalist fiction. The satisfaction of getting through a high-risk, high-difficult scenario using the traits that make you who you are, but in your imagination, so you never actually have to amputate a leg or poop in a chamber pot. So let's examine what else these genres have in common so we can more effectively live out our main character syndrome. Let's talk conflict. A lot of Regency pieces and survivalist pieces are your classic man versus society. The protagonist's goal is survival in a scenario that is built, often by design, for some to rise and even more to fall. Even more specifically, the villain is a hive mind society. Zombies are a really clear example of this, a pandemic that strips away a person's humanity and individuality to only be concerned with the same goal as every other zombie, killing and eating as many humans as possible. In some fiction, like Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, or Army of the Dead if you're more of a Dave Bautista than a Lily James, zombies are even capable of organization and hierarchy so they can more effectively destroy humanity. Survivalist fiction that deals with death matches, like The Hunger Games or Squid Game, the hive mind may have a different, less biological source. It's not always capitalism, but it's probably capitalism. In these stories, the less fortunate must compete against each other for survival, both for their literal lives and often for the promise of a better life should they succeed, all for the entertainment of others. Typically, you'll have a handful of shady leaders running the show, but the true power that makes these games possible is the legion of supporters, who have all been socialized to view this as normal, perhaps necessary, but at the very least, fun. And if a few poor people have to lose their lives to make it all possible, that's just the natural order of things. In period pieces like Bridgerton, the hive mind might not be as dramatic a danger as a zombie virus or a giant motion sensing doll that triggers snipers, but it is strong. This hive mind maintains a status quo based on unspoken but agreed upon social conventions. These conventions allow all those within the society to maintain their relative privilege and perhaps even aspire to more. But it does mean that if any of these rules are broken, even with good reason, the guilty parties risk losing their place in society altogether. Everyone is extremely quick to latch on to Lady Whistledown's gossip and condemn whatever Ton member is the subject of her salacious stories, which is wild because every family we see seems to have some skeletons in their closet that could be uncovered and ruin them at any time. But they're so trained to follow the conventions of their society in hopes that they'll be rewarded for it later that they refuse to set a precedent of forgiveness and acceptance that could save them later. You could probably draw a parallel to how in our modern day society we're quick to celebrate the overprivileged and condemn the underprivileged, despite statistically most of us being much closer to becoming the latter. But I won't, because this is a video about zombies and Empire waist gowns. That's the conflict. Now let's talk more about the hero. What kind of character rises up to overcome the hive mind society and thus let us live vicariously through them as survivors? As we've discussed, the protagonist of both genres must be skilled in their way. They must be a hardy fighter, both physically and mentally strong enough to claw their way out of deadly scenarios, or elegant individuals, both intellectually and emotionally clever enough to take the correct course of action in both high-stakes and mundane scenarios. Now, in real life, skill would be the number one and perhaps only factor in making sure you survive either of these worlds, but because this is fiction, there are a few other elements to consider. First of all, you gotta be an underdog. You can't be so hopeless as to destroy any believability that you wouldn't immediately end up in a zombie's belly, or worse, a spinster. But no one wants to watch a story where the person you expect to come out ahead comes out ahead. Katniss from The Hunger Games is a really good example of this balance in dystopian fiction. Her upbringing has made her resourceful, resilient, and an excellent marksman, but she's still up against much stronger, more experienced opponents who have spent their lives preparing for these games. In Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth is pretty well-read, clever, and comes from a family with enough social standing to rub elbows with the rich and influential. But she also has to contend with crappy inheritance laws that give her and her siblings zero leverage on the marriage market, rich mean girls, busybody mother, and an older sister who is just so much hotter than her. Must also be a rebel in the unjust society you live in, but not too much, at least at first, because if you're too successful in toppling it, we can't live out any more survivalist fantasies. In Squid Game, Sung Gi-hun steps away from winning, almost walks away from the prize to save his frenemies' life, and at the end of the season is implied to be ready to take down the whole organization, which of course makes us love and root for him, but from a storytelling perspective, doesn't actually change much. We're still clearly going to get another season that involves more death games that will live in our minds rent-free. Bridgerton, all the heroines we've had so far lament and in some ways rebel against the injustices of the system they're born into, but by the end of the season, they all end up in happy marriages with well-respected gentlemen, and after that, they don't seem too concerned with challenging the system. I think that's one reason we're also anxiously awaiting Penelope's season. She's the character who has altered the status quo so drastically with her writings as Lady Whistledown, so it will be interesting to see whether that rebellious streak continues when she inevitably finds her happy ending, or whether she'll leave other wallflowers like herself to fight for themselves while she makes out with her friend's brother. Another thing you definitely want to do in these stories is listen to those with more experience than you. This is both realistically and narratively the best way to ensure that you as the underdog can grow enough to become the survivor. In survivalist fiction, if anyone looks like or is Woody Harrelson, you're going to want to listen to what he says. And do it fast, because no matter how badass they are, mentors don't have a great survival rate. In Regency romances, most widows exist entirely to dispense wise advice, but in a pinch, even the girl who got married last season has infinitely more wisdom than you by virtue of having secured herself a man. The last thing our heroes need is a little bit of dumb luck. This can make our own thought experiment about ourselves in these universes a little more difficult because it's such an unknown, but think of it as a free square on a bingo card. If you were the main character in this series, you'd probably catch a lucky break every now and then. Let's be honest, in zombie movies, even the most badass protagonists survive in large part through plot armor. Even if they die at the end, it'll be in some cool, meaningful way that brings their story full circle. Before then, they'll always make it out seconds before the barrier breaks or have one bullet left for the big bad. In Zombieland Double Tap, the writers actually shed light on this fact by introducing two doppelgangers of the main characters, who we expect to act as foils for them for the rest of the movie, but they're killed off almost immediately in what should have been a pretty inconsequential zombie attack. It's as if they're saying, we know, if you did as much risky crap as these guys do, you definitely end up beefing it in some random, unfulfilling way. But then we wouldn't have one movie, let alone this okay-ish sequel. Period pieces, this luck also exists. Sometimes it's as dramatic as a zombie biting the only person who's immune, for example, when you lie to your girlfriend about your name being Ernest, only to find out your birth name actually is Ernest. But usually it comes in the form of the main character in turmoil about whether to choose love or family, duty or passion, only for all obstacles to kind of fall away and them to find themselves with the one person who is both their soulmate and also stupid rich and stuff. That's not to say these characters don't fight for their happy ending, but it would be interesting to see a season of Bridgerton end with the main character having to make that hard choice, The Last of Us style. So, what does it say about us that we fantasize about survival in another time and place, whether it be the violent nightmare of George A. Romero or the heteronormative daydream of Shonda Rhimes? Is it delusional to think that we'd stack up nicely in these fictional universes? Well, let's be real, we're probably regularly overwhelmed by our own much more mundane problems. Or can it be a good reminder that when we do face conflict, we may already have the skills we need to overcome it? What do you think? Am I crazy for thinking these genres bear any similarities? Are there other genres you think share a lot of these conventions? Let me know, and if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. And as always, dear viewer, have a delicious day.